Okay, good evening, a good night of Shabbos. Um, I want to deal with a somewhat perplexing story that we find in the end of Parshas Emor, the story of the megadef, right, of the blasphemer. So the story is found in the Torah. Essentially, reads as follows. Um, It is a story of an individual that describes as a Ben Isha Yisraelis, the son of a Israelite woman, who is also the son of an Egyptian, who goes out and into the midst of the Jewish people and gets involved in a fight in the Machana. Gets a fight in the camp. Ben Yisraelis, Isha Yisraeli. Right, it starts up with some kind of fight with a full-blood Israelite individual, and then this half-Egyptian fellow goes and curses God as part of this story, and is essentially arrested as they are waiting to decide what is actually the halachic standing of this person, what should happen to them. And again, in the end, the divine verdict is that this person is culpable of the death penalty through stoning for his infraction. That's the story as presented. And traditionally, this story is referred to as the story of the megadef, of the blasphemer. So the story itself, obviously, in certain ways, is inherently shocking. Right, the story of this execution for this crime of blasphemy, and certainly there's much that needs to be explained in this story. First of all, again, what does it mean that he cursed God? Again, if he's in a fight with another Jewish person, which seems to be the introduction to the story, right? Well, okay, let him curse that guy. In other words, what in this story is leading to this act of blasphemy against God? But there is perhaps, and we're not going to get into all of the weeds of the story, but I think that there is a much more important, or not more important, there is a much larger structural question here at play. The book of Vayikra, that again we've spent the last couple of months touring our way through, is not a book of narrative, right? That one finds almost no stories in the book of Vayikra. Fundamentally, more than any other book of the Torah, Vayikra is a book of halacha, right? It is a code of sorts, right? The halachos of the Mishkan, of Tum and Tahara, of the structure of Kedusha, right? What does it mean to live a sacred life? What are the obligations, what are the restrictions, and so forth. The role of the Kohanim, again, certainly purity and impurity, again, a major theme. The only other story in all of Sefer Vayikra, right, is one which is in many ways, on the one hand, a natural extension of the halachic subject matter, and that is the story of the erection of the Mishkan, its dedication, right, and the tragic turn, the almost horror-filled turn that it takes with the deaths of Nadav and Avihu, right? That story is a story with tremendous significance for all of Sefer Vayikra, and to a large degree, the aftermath of that story is it sets us up for the whole world of Tuma and Tahara, right? And there's this whole superstructure, right? Nadav and Avihu, they come too close. They did something wrong, right? And then the Torah introduces this whole very strict framework, right, of that various experiences, right, render one tameh, that you're not allowed to go into the Mishkan under those circumstances, and how one emerges from that state to be able to re-engage, right? That is, in many ways, that is the tikkun, the fixing, or perhaps the fallout of the deaths of Nadav and Avihu, right? The deaths of Nadav and Avihu remind us of the significance of being able to create and maintain those boundaries for the encounter with God that takes place within the Mikdash itself, right? So that story, it fits in with the flow of what goes before it. It casts its shadow on everything that comes after it, right? It's a very pivotal device in Sefer Vayikra. This story, on the one hand, and again, even chronologically fits in very well, right? Sefer Vayikra is telling the story of the dedication of the Mishkan. As part of that dedication, which is why we have the korbanos and the miluim, the inaugural offerings that are mapped out, right? That's bread and butter, as it were, of Sefer Vayikra. Here, right, as we're near the end of Sefer Vayikra, we have a story that, number one, it's strange inherently because it's a story, and it's a story that we're not really clear what it has to do with anything around it. Right? So the question is, why is this story here? And we're going to try to propose a number of different answers that are either going to answer what I would call the very narrow question of why bring the story at this particular moment. In other words, in the near context, why is the story here? And then we'll try to expand it out as how this story plays out with Sefer Vayikra as a whole. So one of the perplexing elements of this story is the very ambiguous transition that we have at the very beginning. Right? Vayetze ben Aisha Yisraelis, the son of the Jewish woman, goes out. So Rashi asks a question based on the Midrash, Mehechan Yatza. Where did he go out from? In other words, if we say someone goes out, it sounds like he goes from one thing to another, right? It is, the Torah is signaling to us, right, that there is some kind of setting, right, of where this story comes from. So the first opinion that Rashi gives, right, is, the second opinion that Rashi gives, the opinion of Rav Brechia, is Miparsha Shalamala Yatz. Right, that he left, and his point of departure, right, was what was being talked about immediately prior. So, what is immediately prior? Immediately prior in the Torah is the mitzvah of the lechem hapanim. The lechem hapanim is that every week the Kohanim are supposed to put loaves of bread, right, the so-called showbread, inside the Beis Hamikdash as an offering of sorts to God. They sit there from 1 week until the next, and the next Shabbos they exchange the old bread for new bread, and the old bread is then distributed among the Kohanim, right? Both the Kohanim who are going off duty that week, right, who by the end of the Shabbos, right, are going to return to their homes, and those Kohanim that are coming onto their new shifts on Sunday morning, a whole calculation that we find in Chazal, how to split them up. So the idea, at the end of the day, right, is the Kohanim are eating bread that is essentially a week old. So the Rav Brechia and the Medrash cited by Rashi says that this particular fellow, so this is ridiculous, right? Well, what kind of thing is this? That a king has week old bread that's being served. Bread is supposed to be good and fresh. This is all completely ridiculous, right? So that opinion of Medrash, right, kind of packs everything, right, into this transition from the last section to the next, right? The idea that this is something that happened, and again, perhaps on the teaching or the transmission of this halacha of the lechem hapanim, this person, that leads this person into a place of mockery. The mockery leads into blows, perhaps, right, between him and someone else who we would assume is defending the honor of the Torah here. And in the aftermath of that, the blasphemy, everything takes place, right? So that does not necessarily answer the question of why is this so important that this is, the only other story in the entire Sefer Vayikra, but it does explain the position, right? It happens here as a result of what happens before it. That's approach number one. Approach number two, which is we're going to base on the Bechor Shor and Risham Shafal Hirsch, focus on, as the critical feature here, the fact that this person is identified as a Ben Ish Mitzri, right? That he is an Egyptian. As Rav Hirsch says, that the idea that somehow this is a person, torn by these two identities, right? And that the attachment that he has to his Egyptian past, right? And by extension, his Egyptian values, his Egyptian mores, right? That is what leads him, right, to come to that place of blasphemy, right? The Bechor Shor says specifically, right, that this is, a pharaonic legacy, right? Paro blasphemes against God, right? When Moshe comes to him, I don't know who this God is, what you're talking about, I don't know anything about this. And that this person who comes to blaspheme against God is coming from that background. So what's interesting, right, is that does perhaps give it larger context, right, within Sefer Vayikra, right? So both in Parshas Achremos and Parshas Kedoshim, right, we've made the point a number of different times that the structure of Kedusha that the Torah wants us to aspire to, right, is specifically supposed to be distinct, right, from the world of Mitzrayim, right? The idea that in Egypt and also the inhabitants of Canaan, right, engaged in all kinds of, let's call them anti-Torah behavior, right? And again, so we'll cite the pasuk. He says, "Daber Hashem, Daber b'nei Yisrael, Martalehem, Ani Hashem Elokechem." Speak to the children of Israel and tell them, "I am Hashem, your God." Say, Eretz Mitzrayim Asher Yeshavtem Ba'lo Sasu. Don't act like they did in Egypt, right? So the idea that is not just an isolated pasuk, but that is part of the sanctity mandate of Sefer Vayikra. So if we build on this, right, the significance of this story, right, that this person represents both in his genealogical background, but perhaps more importantly in terms of his value system, right, the resistance to this idea, right, and the idea that the story of his judgment and execution, right, in very stark terms, basically say, look, right, that we are very, very serious about this, right, that the message of Sefer Vayikra, right, of cleaving to a Torah-based lifestyle, right, rather than aping or mimicking an Egyptian way of life, is something of great significance. And then that perhaps helps us answer the question of what this story is doing here in Sefer Vayikra. That this is a illustration, right, of the Maaseh Eretz Mitzrayim principle and how difficult it is to pull away from the world of Mitzrayim. The final approach that I want to share with you is an approach which is, the best of my knowledge, pioneered by Rav Yaakov Meidan, who suggests that this section is perhaps not so much the end of Vayikra as the bridge to Sefer Bamidbar. So let me explain what he means by this. So Rav Meidan has a theory that Vayikra really should be divided into two parts, right? That all the way until we come to the end of Emor, right, is the communication as Vayikra begins, right? These are the things that Hashem said to Moshe in the Ohel Moed, right? And again, that puts it that this is a sefer that begins, right? There is a Mishkan that is constructed. Hashem is communicating to him and giving him all of these halachos, right? That then again continues after the death of Aaron's two sons, right? Again, roughly at the same time. And that really is the structure of Sefer Vayikra. Then we come to next week's parsha, Parshas Bahar, which begins by the Hashem Moshe, Har Sinai Emor. Hashem speaks to Moshe on Har Sinai, saying, right? And that's the famous question of Rashi, Ma'inyan Shemitah Eitzah Har Sinai. What does Shemitah have to do with Har Sinai? Why are we suddenly talking about a communication that happens in Har Sinai, which would seem to be, and again, this is almost like a flashback, right? We've kind of left the world of the Mishkan, the Ohel Moed, and gone back in time to Har Sinai. Okay, so Meidan believes, right, that this last section, right, what begins with next week's Parsha Bahar till the end, right, culminating in Parshas Bechukosai, right, which is basically that what we are reading, right, is the end of the covenant, right, between God and the Jewish people that was forged at Mount Sinai, right, which is again kind of put at the end of Vayikra, almost as an appendix or a summation, right? That the notion of Shemitah is very critical to that covenant. Perhaps we'll delve more into that idea next week. And that it concludes essentially with the terms of the deal, right? What are the terms of the deal, right? That is the bracha and the klala, right? The blessings and the curses, right? And that now we have, again, the covenant, right? Which was so precarious after the sin of the golden calf. Now that at the end of the book of the Mishkan, right, which is again kind of the rapprochement between God and the Jewish people, we then conclude, right, Ela mitzvos asher tziva Hashem es Moshe b'nei Yisrael Har Sinai. These are the mitzvos that were given at Har Sinai. So the way that Rav Meidan wants to read Vayikra is Vayikra through Emor. That's the the new chapter, right? What was taught and revealed to the Jewish people through the Ohel Moed, through the Mishkan, and then, right, we kind of close out that whole section, right, by a callback to the covenant Har Sinai, the world of Shemitah and Yovel, and that culminates with the brachos and klalos, with the terms of the deal between God and the Jewish people. So he says, if this is correct, right, really, right, kind of the chronological end of Sefer Vayikra is not the end of Vayikra, it's the end of Emor. Right, in other words, that after Emor, and Emor ends with the story of the megadef, Vayikra is over, right? And we go back in time to something that's almost like a Shmos-like section that we bring here as a symbol that the Ohel Moed has now sealed the deal of the atonement for the golden calf. And now the covenant is back in good shape. We're ready to go. And that brings us into the world of Sefer Vayikra. But he says there's something very interesting. There's a Rashi bring the measures that we cited before that Rashi quotes suggests Vayetze, right? Where does this half Israelite fellow, what's his point of departure? Says that because he is half Israelite, his father is an Egyptian, that he cannot find himself an encampment, right, an appropriate place to live, right, with the rest of the tribe of Dan. The tribe of Dan basically says, even though your mother, who's mentioned in the Pesukim, right, is Shlomis Bas Divri, she's somebody from the tribe of Dan, your father is not from Dan, you don't belong here, right? This is someone who doesn't fit in to the system, right? And his reaction, right, to this, so first of all, again, and this is textually rooted in the words, Vayinatzu b'machaneh. They fought in the camp. Now, it's interesting, right? The whole idea of the camp, right? The encampment is not something we really deal with in Sefer Vayikra. It's not a Sefer Vayikra theme. Right? Sefer Vayikra, we're very focused on the Mishkan, on the Ohel Moed, on the center of the camp, right? And the very central, right, what's called Machane Shechina, right? The dwelling, as it were, of God, right? But the camp itself, that's Sefer Vayikra. Sefer Vayikra is all about the camp, how the camp is set up, how it travels, the tensions between the tribes and the flag. I mean, that's classic Sefer Vayikra is about the Machane. So he says that what is the point of this story, right? That Sefer Vayikra, right, has almost like, has directed our eyes heavenwards, right? And we've been talking about the idea of how a sanctity-focused society is going to structure itself, right? What are the rules? What are the tools? Tumen Dara, all the stuff that we've that's been working through Sefer Vayikra. He says the point of this story is to almost, I would say, to ground us, right, of how does this actually, right, integrate into a social reality, right? We have people that we have to deal with, right? We have, again, here we have a tragic story of the Ben Isha Yisraelis, right, of this guy who doesn't have a place to live. So now, right, this is almost the bridge into the world of Sefer Vayikra. We're going to talk about where does every tribe live, right? But also the idea there are people that don't fit into that, right? There's the ger, right, who somebody steals from, right? And that we discussed at the fourth or fifth chapter of Sefer Vayikra, right? And the transition from the halachic world of Sefer Vayikra, right, to the nation in the camp world of Sefer Vayikra is the story, right? It's the idea that these are the stakes of setting up the machane in a proper way to be able to find both physically, but more important conceptually, right? How are people going to be integrated into this structure? And according to that approach, that is the significance of the story, that this is the introduction to Sefer Vayikra. So again, to sum up three approaches. One, what I would call the very localized approach. The second opinion, the Medrash, that says that this is a story about the mockery, which leads to blasphemy, about the last mitzvah that's mentioned, right? In other words, it's not necessarily a big story approach. It's about the fallout from the halacha of lechem hapanim, which is mentioned here. That's approach number one. Approach number two focuses on the Egyptian identity of the megadef, and the idea, and that we wanted to extend that, right? That this is a human illustration, right? An incident that colors what it means, right, to move away from the Maseh Eretz Mitzrayim, from the actions, from the lifestyle of Egypt. Finally, the approach of Rav Dan that we ended with suggests that Parshas Emor really is the end of the main part of Sefer Vayikra, and that our story really turns on this notion of the emergence of the word machaneh, which is going to preoccupy Sefer Bamidbar. That we are, by bringing in the story, we are almost kind of like, this is the cliffhanger of Sefer Vayikra. How are we going to take all these ideas and concepts that we find in Sefer Vayikra and translate them into human terms in a way that will hopefully avoid these kinds of incidents going further? A good Shabbos to everyone.